Hi friends, it's Nate, and I want to share an update about the future of this show. For 8 years, I've hosted this podcast, and it's been called Almost Heretical. It started as a small project and eventually became something much bigger than I ever expected. The show connected with people all over the world who were questioning, deconstructing, or re-examining Christianity, people who felt caught between belief and disbelief, people who still cared about Jesus, God, the Bible, but they no longer felt at home in the faith they had previously. That season mattered to me a lot, and it mattered to a lot of listeners. Before I go any further, I want to say something clearly about deconstruction. Deconstruction is often portrayed really badly by Christian leaders as rebellion, bitterness, or a desire to just tear everything down. And that hasn't been my personal experience or story. For me, deconstruction was an honest process driven by a desire to understand and make sense of what I believe. It's what happens when inherited answers stop working for you. Before I explain where the show is headed now, I want to explain a little bit about how I got here. I've always been someone who needs to understand how things work. When I was a kid, I remember my family got new appliances. Like we got a new blender one time, and I'd always ask for the old one so I could take it out to my shop in the garage and open it up with my tools and see what was going on inside. I wanted to understand it. I didn't want to just break it. I wanted to understand how it worked, why it worked, and how anyone could be confident that it worked in the first place, like what was going on in there. And I'm still like that today. Christianity was given to me early in life, and for a long time it made sense. I spent years devoted to full-time ministry. But about 10 years ago, when I was living in San Francisco and planting churches in the city with my friend Francis Chan, I hit a wall. I was exhausted, burnt out from full-time ministry, and from trying to live what I believed was a relentlessly radical version of Christianity. I had assumed that if I gave everything to God, I would feel close to Him, grounded, confident. But instead, I felt tired and disillusioned and unsure of what I actually believed anymore. So I stepped back because I needed space to slow down and to reflect. And after a couple years, I wanted to start processing all of that. Almost Heretical was born out of that moment. At first, the show wasn't me rejecting Christianity or something. It was just me trying to make sense of how I ended up trying to live a radical life, following Jesus, and having it not really give what I thought it would. I was disillusioned, honestly, but this was sort of before deconstruction was really a thing. And in some ways, I think the journey of Almost Heretical was me deconstructing in public. And I think helping to usher in the deconstruction movement. If you've watched someone go through deconstruction or maybe gone through deconstruction yourself, you probably recognize the pattern. You start pulling on one thread, and pretty soon the whole system you were given starts to wobble and fall apart. Things that once felt solid begin to feel fragile, and often what you're actually losing aren't core Christian claims, but versions of Christianity that developed much later, interpretations specific to your tradition, or confident explanations that were handed to you by a leader or a teacher or just Christian church culture. Those ideas may have been treated as definitive and settled, and over time, they became part of your foundation. So when they fall, it can feel like everything is falling, even if what's really happening is that you're discovering how much of your faith was built on assumptions you didn't know were there. And for me, Almost Heretical became the place where that unraveling happened in real time. Over the years, dominoes started to fall, slowly and honestly, sometimes painfully. And eventually I reached a point where I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. Not just about Christianity, but about what ultimately grounded meaning and purpose in life. I found that deconstruction often leads to a season where old frameworks are gone, but nothing solid has replaced them yet. It's not necessarily despair, but it's kind of an open, unsettled space. I still admired Jesus. I still valued the community and the ethics, but I no longer believed the central claims of Christianity, including that Jesus rising from the dead had actually happened. And at that point, I honestly thought that was the end of Christianity for me. Through doing the show, I became less certain, not more. Over time, I found myself unsure, not just about Christianity, but about meaning and purpose and what, if anything, was actually solid underneath life itself. For more than 8 years, the show became a space to talk openly about doubt, loss of certainty, and the questions people often feel aren't really allowed in church. It resonated deeply with people. Millions of downloads, thousands of messages, people who felt less alone because someone was finally saying the quiet part out loud. And I'm really grateful for that chapter. But something has changed in me. What began to shift things for me wasn't stepping away from deconstruction, but continuing deconstructing. I kept digging. I kept asking harder questions. I followed those doubts as far as they would go. And over time, I started to notice that some of the conclusions I was being encouraged toward also required a blind faith of their own. Deconstruction is very good at taking things apart, but I wasn't compelled by many explanations I heard, as they didn't make much better sense of the historical or textual evidence I was starting to discover. In some cases, I found myself being asked to adopt new assumptions about reality and meaning or human experience that just felt as unexamined as the ones I had let go of. I had also become aware that within parts of the deconstruction space that I had helped to create, there was often an understandable but real tilt toward explaining Christianity specifically away. Whenever I started to notice strong motives driving conclusions, it made me want to slow down and examine those conclusions more carefully rather than simply inherit them. And as I did, I started running into evidence I hadn't really been taught to look at before. I didn't even know much of it existed. I began listening to historians and philosophers and scientists and biblical scholars who took these questions seriously, and they weren't asking me to turn off my brain. What struck me wasn't that this was all completely new, because I had heard pieces of it before, but for most of my life, I hadn't really paid that much attention to the evidence side of things, partially because I was so focused on trying to live radically for Jesus, and honestly, I kind of assumed that people who needed to know the foundations were somehow weaker in their faith. But I hadn't spent much time actually engaging the real scholarship, the historical work, the newer research even that serious scholars have been producing and refining over the last few years and several decades. And once I started digging, I felt like I was falling down a deep rabbit hole, and I loved it. It really sparked that figuring out how things work aspect of myself. And the more I studied the New Testament historically, the more it read like people doing their best to describe something they believed they had actually witnessed. Not polished myths or abstract theology, but accounts rooted in real places, real people, and public events, told with the kinds of awkward and inconvenient details you probably wouldn't invent if you were trying to create a legend. So many details and distances and elevations and naming statistics and so much more that other ancient texts and other religions just don't have in their texts. At the same time, I was also engaging arguments for the existence of God that I had previously dismissed without really understanding. Questions about the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of physical constants, and the staggering amount of information encoded in DNA. I had absorbed the idea that science quietly made belief in God unnecessary and impossible. And what surprised me was that, for me, studying the science more deeply was actually pushing me back toward God, not away. It seemed to make better sense of the evidence than the alternatives. As this unfolded, I became increasingly aware that there are a lot of really thoughtful, intellectually serious people who have looked at the same evidence and become more convinced in the Christian story, not less. And I explored skeptical explanations as well from atheists and agnostics. I read the critical scholars. I took seriously the idea that the Christian story might be invented, exaggerated, misunderstood. But over time, those explanations stopped making the most sense of the data for me. And at that point, I felt like I had a few real options. I could conclude that the Christian story was entirely invented or slowly constructed over time, despite the early sources and the number of people involved. I could argue that something unusual had happened, but that it was later misunderstood or layered with meaning that didn't really belong to the events themselves. Or I could take seriously what so many thoughtful historians and scholars and scientists had concluded before me, that these events really did happen and the people closest to them were doing their best to tell the truth about what they saw, and that this explanation actually makes better sense of the evidence than the alternatives. And that last option is the one that increasingly felt more plausible to me. In other words, continuing to deconstruct didn't lead me away from Christianity forever. It led me back, slowly and unexpectedly, through evidence that I hadn't fully reckoned with before. Slowly, over time, the scale began to tip, not to certainty, but to strong confidence, I would say. What surprised me the most was how little of this had ever really come together for me before in a coherent way. I don't think I'd ever fully understood a really solid case for the Christian story as a claim about reality itself. What I had was mostly a faith shaped by internal experience with some apologetics sprinkled into that, and that version just couldn't survive my sustained questioning on its own. So what I know now is that Christianity didn't begin as a feeling-based belief system. It began as a claim about history, From the start, it was rooted in things that were said to have happened out in the open, in real places, involving real people in public. The earliest Christian writings talk about names you could check, cities you could visit, roads people traveled, events that were public enough to be disputed if someone wanted to dispute them. In other words, it presents itself as a story about something that either happened in history or didn't. Paul says a creed that he received in the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15. And for years, I think I couldn't really say it honestly, but I think I can now after my research and my deep dives that I've been on. I think I can say that for what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles and to Paul. And I'm not certain of this, but I am quite sure now. Okay, now this is important. That confidence I have, it doesn't mean that I think every theological system or doctrine developed over the last 2,000 years is automatically right. It doesn't mean I suddenly have simple answers about salvation and hell and how everything works, because I don't have that. What I keep coming back to are the earliest claims of the earliest Christians that Jesus is Lord, that he was raised, and that this event means something real has happened in the world, bringing the kingdom of God. Beyond that, Christians have done a lot of thoughtful work trying to understand what those claims can mean, and I'm really excited to, with humility, to keep working through those and see what's possible. And I want to keep digging. That's why this show is changing. Almost Heretical served its purpose for the season that I was in, but I'm no longer deconstructing in the normal sense of the word. And when I really think about it, what deconstruction was for me was always trying to get to the core. I thought that process was leading me away from Christianity and away from God. And to my surprise, instead, it led me back, but in a very different way. And this new chapter of the show is called Faith Lab. Faith Lab exists because I discovered there was far more historical, philosophical, and scientific evidence for the Christian story than I ever thought. Evidence many Christians haven't really been shown or not shown in a put-together way. And it's evidence that I think deserves to be examined carefully and honestly and without fear. This isn't about pretending questions don't matter, and it's not about asking people to believe against their better judgment. It's about recovering a version of Christianity that understands faith not as a blind leap, but as a trust grounded in evidence. And on Faith Lab, I'll sit down with scholars and experts and ask them to explain their work in a clear and accessible way. This isn't for academics. This is for ordinary people like me. I'm going to ask the questions that I want to ask and try to summarize and explain things in a simple way because, honestly, I need that. I don't want to get bored with super heady and academic explanations. And make it make sense for me. That's the goal. Because I hope if it makes sense for me, it'll make sense for you too. So if you're still deconstructing and things are still falling apart for you right now, you're totally welcome here. I know how disorienting that season can be, and I'm deeply sympathetic to it. If you're the person who goes to church every week and everyone assumes you have no questions at all, but privately you're carrying doubts and you don't feel safe asking them out loud, I see you. I am doing this show for you, and I genuinely want to hear your questions, and I hope this is a helpful place for you to get more confidence in your trust in the Christian story. And if you've been in church your whole life, you're fully committed, but you're starting to realize that maybe you don't have the solid foundations for why you believe this, and you want to move from that blind faith to actual trust grounded in evidence, you're exactly where you should be, and I'm really glad you're here. I'm making this show for you. I don't want to lose my curiosity. I don't want to lose my ability to ask those hard questions and use my full brain. I want to test things and see how they hold up, and increasingly, I believe Christianity does. I believe the Christian story is true. And if it really is true, then it should be able to stand up to historical, archaeological, and intellectual scrutiny. That's what this show is about. I want to bring thoughtful, credible experts onto Faith Lab and ask them to present their strongest cases for the Christian story so we can actually look at the evidence and deal with it honestly and have our trust strengthened. From the beginning, Scripture treats faith as something that can be examined and tested. Israel was told not to believe a prophet simply because he claimed divine authority, but to evaluate whether his words actually came true. That's in Deuteronomy 18. God says through Isaiah, "Come now, let us reason together," Isaiah 1. The psalmist invites people to taste and see that the Lord is good in Psalm 34. These are not calls to shut your mind down. These are invitations to engage and to examine, to experience. The New Testament continues that same pattern. Luke explains that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so that his readers could know the certainty of what they had been taught. John says he records the signs of Jesus so that people may believe. Thomas is invited to examine the evidence of the resurrection by Jesus himself rather than being scolded for wanting proof. In Acts, the Bereans are praised because they examined the scriptures daily to see if what Paul was saying was actually true. Peter insists we did not follow cleverly devised myths, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. In 2 Peter, he says that. John warns, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. That's 1 John. Paul echoes the same idea. He writes, test everything, hold fast to what is good in 1 Thessalonians. And he makes his stakes unmistakably clear. 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is useless. In other words, the Bible itself treats faith as trust that rests on reality. It invites scrutiny. It welcomes testing. It insists that if the central claims aren't true in the real world, then Christianity collapses with them. So I don't think that faith is meant to be a blind leap, but many of us have kind of grown to think that's what it is. I think faith is meant to be trust that grows out of good reasons, careful thought, honestly looking at reality. And that's what Faith Lab is all about. And I'm really glad you're here. So if you want to learn more, if you want to support the show, you can visit faithlabshow.com. Supporters get access to our private community, ad-free listening, bonus episodes. You can also email us at hi@faithlabshow.com. I'd really love to hear all your questions and thoughts. And specifically, I'd love to hear your story of your tipping point when you came to realize that the Christian story held up and you trusted it. I'm really excited to see where we're all going to go together. Thanks for being on this journey with me.